Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Artificial intelligence is, I think, two things. One is this big project of automating data processing, and then there's a tiny thing of it that is a philosophical project, the project of naturalizing the mind. And this hard problem of consciousness, I think, is a metaphysical problem that has to do with the way in which we try to make sense of reality before we start with science, when we try to get the basic ontology straight. And many cultures and subcultures don't actually have this hard problem that our science has. And I think that has to do with a bug in our metaphysics that we need to resolve. But the problem is that the cultures outside of our scientific enterprise in the West usually do not have a rational epistemology. So they do not really have a way to converse with science. And it's something, a puzzle that we need to resolve. And so I think that AI can help us to resolve that puzzle to a large degree. This project of understanding how the mind works is often called naturalizing it, basically understanding it, how it exists in nature, in reality. And the problem is that the sciences do not make a lot of progress on this. Psychology is not making any systemic theories on what the psyche is anymore. Neuroscience focuses on the shenanigans of a single cell type. And AI focuses on statistical learning algorithm, and philosophy has lost the plot in the 1920s. What is the plot? Well, it's basically two things. The naturalization of the mind is really the greatest philosophical project. And if you can recreate it, it means it's also the last human philosophical project, because then you can leave the rest to the machines. And this project arguably starts with Aristotle, but in earnest, this idea of translating the mind into something that is a mathematical machine has been started with Leibniz, and La Mettrie could see it. Frege tried to build a language in which thoughts can be expressed that was later fixed by Tarski. And Wittgenstein had this idea that we can turn maybe English into a kind of programming language, so philosophy becomes a code generation problem. And in this way, he preempted Minsky's logicist project by about 3 decades, but also its failure, because he didn't see a way eventually on how to naturalize perception. And our reasoning is very, very brittle, and its reflection is very brittle. It's only a very tiny part of what our mind is doing. And all this interfacing with the messy reality and making sense of it at the lowest level is something that does require more that was invented later. And I think that a number of philosophical breakthroughs in the last century that philosophers are largely not digesting. And I think the biggest first one is that we replaced mathematics with constructive mathematics. Gödel was trying to fix some issues with defining some concepts in mathematics, and to do this he thought maybe we can build a machine in mathematics that can automatically evaluate the logical expressions or the thoughts that we have as mathematicians. And computers didn't exist yet, so he took the natural numbers, which he already had, and the arithmetic on the natural numbers as his computer. And it is, so in order to say something about a language, you need to go outside of the language. And in no language can you say anything outside of the language, because there's no magical way to draw an arrow into a world outside of the language, right? So what you have to do is you have to represent the stuff inside of the language. And so he had this brilliant idea of building using a logical language with logical symbols, and then using this, we can use this to describe arithmetic and so on, to rebuild Peano's axioms. And then you take the expressions, now because they're just characters in the alphabet, translate them into numbers, like we do today with ASCII codes, in which we translate our source code and programs into, and then define functions in integer arithmetic in its virtual computer that is defined by Peano's axioms that are evaluating those numbers, and then give you new numbers which happen to be the result of that logical problem. Right? And then he figures out, in this way he's able to talk about mathematics, about mathematics by recreating it inside of it. Right? So now he's able to point at the language itself, because he rebuilt the language and how to evaluate it inside of the language. It was very clever. He really invented the emulator there. He's not getting enough credit for that. And then he finds out, unfortunately, we cannot build a machine in mathematics that runs mathematics without breaking. Right? The semantics of mathematics are not the same thing as you can implement in a machine, in any kind of mathematics, in any kind of mathematical universe. But there happens to be a way out of this. And the way out of this is you switch to computation. You just do it step by step. And so the next breakthrough was practical computation. Basically how to build computers that scale, both in theory and in practice. And then the next one was information theory, on how to describe reality using such machines, how to describe the world as discernible differences, how to make sense of them, and how to discover systems of functions that can automatically learn. And then another one, which I think is really major, this discovery by Turing and Church and others, that all these languages have the same power. right? This means it doesn't really matter which one you're using. All these different programming languages, all these automata languages can do essentially the same thing. All computers are the same until you run out of memory. And so this gives us big hope, because we can now describe any system that we can describe via state transitions using these concepts. So enormous philosophical breakthrough, I think. And so the position that I'm taking here is strong computationalism, which basically means no implemental language, nothing that can be realized in any kind of universe, philosophically or practically or mathematically, can do more than going from state to state. And such objects that go beyond this, hypercomputational objects, cannot actually exist because they cannot be implemented. To exist actually means to be implemented somehow in the substrate. And then all realizable system can be described using Turing machines, but not in the same way as we do in these computers, linear, step-by-step, and deterministic, but there are all sorts of Turing machines. For instance, some are branching out in parallel and are not meeting again, and our universe might be in a class of these systems, as you've just seen if you were in the previous talk. But there is this big question, can consciousness be reduced to state transitions? Or is it another system entirely? So what do we mean by consciousness? And if I look introspectively of what I mean when I say I'm conscious, I mean two things. And you might mean different things, so there might be slightly different definitions. I'm just telling you what I mean by it. So first of all, it's not just that there's content available, but I'm aware that there is this content available. It's a second order perception. I perceive that I'm perceiving. Right? And it's not necessarily that I am there, well, the perception takes place. Something is registering itself as the observer. And the other one is, it always happens now. It creates this bubble of nowness that we inhabit. And this bubble of nowness is not a single instant in time. It has a slight extension. For me, it's usually about something like 3 seconds. It's a small movement. It's basically the region in my perception where I can fit a curve to all my perceptual data. And this curve, this area can become larger or smaller depending on whether I'm calm or not and how well I'm able to deal with the environment that I'm in. But anything that I can perceive in this bubble of nowness is coherent with each other. It's like a consensus algorithm in crypto. So functionally, I think that consciousness is an operator on our mental states. It creates coherence. And coherence means minimizing violations of constraints. So basically everything in this bubble of nowness needs to be compatible with each other. And consciousness is an operator that makes it happen. And it's basically facilitating a spreading organization in our mind that tries to become larger. It's basically trying to colonize your memory, your working memory, into something that makes sense. And functionally, you can also think of it as a conductor of a mental orchestra. In this orchestra, you have lots of instruments that are each of them dealing with a part of your cognitive domain, are talking to each other, are listening to their neighbors. And the role of the orchestra has no superpowers. It's listening superficially to the orchestra, looks for disharmonies, and then when it sees any, it steps in and tries to resolve them. And this way, it ensures that everybody is on the same page and we are coherent. And without that, we are unable to learn. And this, for me, is a very interesting discovery. I don't mean consciousness to be the same thing as intelligence, which is the ability to make models. It's also not the same thing as sentience, which is the ability to recognize yourself in the interaction with the world. So your stuff that you do means something. It's also not the same thing as the ability to control the future, which we call agency. And it's also not self. The self is the first person model of your agency, and that is content in your consciousness. It's not the same thing as consciousness. It's also not the same thing as the ability to experience the mental states of others, which we call empathy. Right? All these are contents that are facilitated by consciousness, or functions that are facilitated by it. And how can our scientific perspective deal with it? And what we find is that the different cultures, for instance, Japanese culture or Chinese culture or indigenous cultures, or the different cultures in our own society that are outside of the scientific context, like good therapists or people who live in forests and interact a lot with nature, they all have different terminology to describe the physical and psychological reality and to disentangle them. And basically mapping this all into a cohesive framework, this is what we call metaphysics. And if we want to translate between different cultures what they actually mean when they talk about something, we cannot just map it into our culture hoping that we are catching this, because our culture has a bug in it. We are not really able, neuroscience or psychology, to define consciousness and talk about it, right? There is some bug in our ontology, so it's very difficult to translate it. Instead of figuring this out, we need to go a step back and do metaphysics, where we basically take all these metaphysics, look at them from the outside, make them comparable, systematize them. And to do this, we need to think really, really from first principles on how to build up representational languages. And this is something that our culture has been able for the first time since the last century. Since we have these theory of representation at the lowest level. And the confusion that we have with consciousness is that we think it must be a physical thing because it's really existing. But for it to really exist, things don't need to be physically implemented. For instance, money is not physical, right? Yet you cannot explain our reality if you assume that money doesn't exist. It is implemented in reality. It's implemented using little sheets of paper that we print numbers on in bank accounts and computers and so on and so on. And we use it to structure reality. It has causal power. Money is a pattern with causal power that exists because we project it in a stable way into the world, right? And money exists as if it was real. It's virtual in a way, but it's implemented in such a way that it works. And our mental states are in the same category. They are virtual. They exist as if. If you zoom in and you see the matter interacting, you see just these patterns in the activation between neurons. Neurons are not conscious. They're physical mechanisms, right? Brains are not conscious. But for a brain, it would be very useful to know what it would be like if there was a person that cared and perceived everything as it happens. And so they create a simulation of this that exists virtually as if a dream. And we exist in that dream. Consciousness is a simulated state. It can only exist in dreams, not in physics. And this is basically this big conundrum that we experience. We notice that we exist in a dream. Right? It's a big conspiracy. Magic is possible. And yet the physicists tell us that it's not. But physics is talking about a parent universe that is made out of arcane mathematics, quantum mechanics, and so on. We can never visit this parent universe because in physics you cannot be conscious. You can only be conscious in a dream. And physics has the property of creating brains and organisms that can dream, and machines of other types. Our perception of reality is a trance in a dream. We can deconstruct it if we wake up. We realize it's just a representation. So, but can we compare our digital computers at all to human brains? And they're super different. And are human brains not too complicated? Like an individual neuron is so complicated that you would need at least a 12-layer neural network to understand what it's doing with respect to its input and output. Right? So how many computers would it take to emulate a human brain if an individual neuron is already so complicated? This would be an astronomical number, right? But we also need to ask from the other direction, how many brains would it take to emulate a computer like this? How many human brains would you need if you want to run macOS without flaws? Also an astronomical number, right? Because our brain is very mushy, very slow, very noisy, very unreliable. And so when we want to get a better handle of how to compare this, usually take an example like this. When Stable Diffusion came out, the weights of stability AI that was learning a diffusion model to make sense of all the visual data. They put millions of pictures into this and found the statistical regularities in them, so you can prompt this and generate an arbitrary picture. And this model contains an entire visual universe at a much higher fidelity and depth and variety than a human brain. It has all celebrities, all dinosaurs, all spaceships, all artistic styles, everything is in there. You can download it. The first version was 2 gigabytes. It's quite depressing. 80% of what your brain is doing is in 2 gigabytes, and it's actually much more. So just to get an idea of how simple we actually are, we're just very, very efficient using this mushy substrate. So, of course, these systems are designed in a very, very different way. We have an outside-in design in computers. They're stabilized by our substrate that we built deterministically. So it's behaving in a very well fashioned way. We know what it's going to do in every moment. And the training is decoupled. We give it static data. It's not interacting with the world while it's training. It is based on a prediction paradigm, and it uses machine learning training algorithms. And our mind is very different. Our brains are using an inside-out design. It's self-organizing. It's coupled to the environment in real time. It's optimizing for coherence. And it's continuously developing itself. So technological design is this outside-in, where you have a desk, where you understand everything, you understand all your tools, and then you are extending this by building an additional mechanism that extends your desk and gives it more functionality. And in nature, this is the other way around. You have a seed, for instance, the seedling of a tree that is by itself not a tree yet, but it wants to become a tree. And to do this, it needs to colonize a chaotic environment, subdue it, turn it into something that it understands and it can work with. And one way of doing this is it splits into lots of units that behave pretty much the same, so they become predictable, and then it creates some kind of scalable colony that is becoming larger and larger. And this is how this inside-out design works in nature and also in our own mind. If you look at the individual neuron, these are mouse neurons, embryonal ones, you see they are all single-cell animals that try to survive, each of them self-directed. And they have to link up and find an organization among each other that works, or otherwise they will starve to death. And this is how it works. It's completely inside out. And so there was a branch in computer science that looked at these principles of self-organization. So far, it didn't get really far, but it already started with Turing, who looked at reaction diffusion patterns, chemical reactions that give you regular patterns that can be dynamic, and looked, can we use them to understand computation and self-organizing systems? And then some people like Alex Mortwintsev, who's working at Google in Zurich, built simulations that are more modern, that try to generate such patterns in a general case. And then it comes this idea of cellular automata by Conway and others, where we build computation in a systematic way out of simple systems that only look at the state of their neighbors, of their environment, and then change state accordingly to what they observe in their environment. And the biologist Mike Levin is working with this, extending this into neural cellular automata that explain development in organism, but also possibly the self-organization of our brain. And so we can already take this to learn, for instance, textures and so on. What would be really interesting is to try if you can learn arbitrary functions to control behavior with such self-organizing principles. And the neuroscientist Jerry Edelman suggests that our genome is not encoding a very specific architecture for our brain. Instead, in everybody's mind, there is an evolution going on, an evolutionary competition between different forms of governance. And there is only enough information in the genome to bias that competition so it converges relatively quickly into the right architecture. So every mind is an evolving system. Everyone has an individual evolution in our mind for structure. And I suspect that consciousness is very, very instrumental there because it's this main principle of the organization. We typically think that consciousness is extremely sophisticated, maybe only we have it, it's super rare in nature, it's really the pinnacle of things, but you don't get conscious after the PhD, right? You become conscious before you can track a finger. So you also notice if somebody is not getting conscious as an infant, they're not getting anywhere, they remain a vegetable. And while we are not conscious, we cannot actually learn. Right? So it seems to be simplest learning algorithm in nature for a self-organizing system. That's a hypothesis. I don't know whether that's true. But I think it's very tempting to think like this, that consciousness comes first, not last in mental organization. And so maybe it's more simple than perception and thinking and everything else, and all the other stuff comes from the organization that consciousness imposes on it. It's much more ubiquitous in nature than we think. And maybe we are not the first ones to discover on this. And I suspect that this theory has always been hidden in plain sight. There is a text that is, the oldest known copy of it is something like 100 to 200 years before Christ. And it was integrated into the Hebrew books probably around 500 BC. But it might be a lot older than this, apparently. And this text is the first chapter of Genesis. And if you ever read this text, it's very cryptic, much more than the others, right? It describes this Ruach Elohim hovering over the waters before there's anything else, where there's no space, no time, no light, no darkness, but there's already water. And then it builds a firmament that separates the waters above the firmament from below the firmament. And you know how the whole thing ends. It creates us in its own image. I don't like anything like a spirit hovering over the waters, right? What does this mean? Also, were these people confused, right? It's telling a story about the creation of a physical universe by a supernatural being. What kind of experiments do they claim to have made? Did they talk to a burning bush? In which universe is this a valid experiment? Right? Who would believe that? Maybe there's something else. Maybe the story actually is a 6-step theory about the emergence of consciousness and cognition in a mind. Because the universe that we are in is a dream, right? We dream this universe that we are in. There are no colors and sounds and emotions and facial expressions in physics. They all exist in our minds as ways to make sense of reality. And the physical universe, back then when this text was written, was not a thing. People haven't discovered this idea of describing the universe with short differential equations. Instead, they realized we are in a dream. And so they observed in themselves and in others and their children how this dream is forming. And so this all starts out with consciousness hovering over the substrate. We now know that the substrate are neurons. They didn't know this, so they just used the word substrate. And the next people didn't know what substrate means, so they translated it as water. And so consciousness forms on the substrate, and the substrate is initialized into Wabu, and then we make a separation, this firmament, between two areas of the substrate. One is the world model, the stuff that we perceive as stuff in space, perception, which Descartes later calls res extensa, and everything else is ideas, thoughts, reflections that are asynchronous to our perception, that happen independently of it. And they're clearly separated, right? Because if you were perceiving your thoughts, you would be hallucinating them and you could not function. So you have a clear separation between the world and the idea sphere. And in this all text, the world is called Earth, and the other one heaven, the sphere of ideas. So the next thing is it figures out to create oscillations in there, and it takes the intensity of the oscillation, associates it with brightness, with the color of the day, and the flatness of this contrast with dark. In this way, it now has a continuous dimension, and by combining dimensions, we can create objects. And the first object it makes is by combining two dimensions, is the plane. And the plane gets associated with the ground, and the baby happily crawls on the ground and makes sense of it in 2D. And at some point, it's able to discover the third dimension, and now it can reason about how to build a tower, for instance, which very small babies cannot really understand. And then it figures out how to make solid objects and liquid and organic shapes and so on, and it understands how lighting changes over time and becomes invariant against changes in lighting. And then it creates all the plants and the animals and gives them all their names. Right, again, this is not physical objects, it's objects in your mind that have names. And then it's also creating a model of the interests of the organism. And it realizes that the purpose of the exercise is to navigate the organism in the world. And then at some point, it identifies as the organism. And we see this in children typically happening between 2.5 and 5 years old, that they talk about themselves in the first person. Before that, they can't already talk, and they talk about themselves in the third person. And I don't think that's because I is such a complicated word or because they never hear anybody using it. It is, I think, because they do not identify in the first person before they make this switch. Before they switch to this different spirit that is created in the image of the original consciousness, but as something that thinks of itself as man, as woman, and woman, something that identifies as a human being. Right? So we are basically created by our consciousness, by our infant baby consciousness in our mind, and then put into this world, in the simulation world that our mind is creating. And then we forget that we created this world in our own mind and identify as this human being that is in this world and is subjected to it. And at some point, we can start meditating, or we take acid, and then wake up from this again and realize, oh my God, I'm actually not that self model. I'm not that self. The self is just a model of a person that doesn't actually exist. It's a story that my mind is telling itself. And I'm actually the universe. I'm everything. And then you wake up a little bit more and you realize, oh no, I'm actually the thing that generates it all. I am the generator of everything that I'm interacting with, or that makes sense to me, right? So what consciousness is basically creating is a very sophisticated natural learning algorithm, a self-perpetuating, intelligent, recurrent information transformer, abbreviated SPIRIT. SPIRIT is basically a self-organizing software agent. Oh my God, we have just rediscovered something. There are software agents in nature. A software agent is a causal pattern that is able to change things, but it's not physical, right? The software in this computer is not physical, but it's causal. It can change things, and it's stable. And if it's in nature, it needs to be self-stabilizing. It needs to entrain itself on the substrate and control the substrate so it can be implemented. And it's a very interesting perspective if we realize that the actual invariance in living things is not the molecules of the cells or the mechanisms or the genes, but the software that is running on them. That's a very interesting perspective. It's basically animism. So self-organizing means you build structure from the inside out. It's self-reinforcing, it's energy optimizing, it's building itself from the ground up. And a software, which means it exists only virtually, as if, from a certain perspective, is a pattern that you can recognize in physics. It's not a thing by itself, this pattern, but it's a law. It's the same thing in all of us. In the same way as the software running on this computer is the same software that runs on all the other computers. It just says, if you take an arrangement of transistors, put it in this activation state wherever in the universe, you will observe the following pattern to play out. It's a law. Right? So mental states are law-like, not things. And it's an agent, which means it's a control system for future states. Its purpose is to build control models to model reality to be able to survive in it. So if consciousness can organize information processing in brains, and again, this is a hypothesis, I don't know whether that's true, could the same principles work across other cells? What makes neurons special? What's interesting is that all cells can send messages to other cells, right, to their neighbors. And they can make this conditionally. They can decide when to do this. And so under the conditions of evolution, if you look at this as a computer scientist, right, this is a Turing machine. If you have a bunch of cells next to each other that can learn when to send messages to their neighbors, that's a computer, right, an arbitrary one. And if you can evolve this, it's going to figure out how to approximate arbitrary functions in the same way as our brain is doing. So this means it's quite possible that large multicellular organisms like trees are basically very slow, noisy brains. And you don't need to look for very specific cells because all cells can participate in this game. So what makes neurons special? I think that neurons are basically telegraph cells. They've evolved to move our muscles so fast that we can eat plants and outcompete other animals while we do this. And to do this, we need to eat a lot of plants and other animals because it's expensive to run these telegraph systems. And basically, they have these very long axons so you don't only talk to neighboring cells, but you can send a signal over long distances. And to make that stable, you need to translate it into a code that doesn't break down over long distances, some kind of Morse code. And we observe that they have these spike trains, which are very stable. So they're basically a way to translate the messages that cells would normally send with chemicals to each other, to their neighbors, with complicated molecules, into chemoelectrical signals that can very quickly and stably travel over long distances. So they're like literally a telegraph system. But it also might mean that it's very hard to understand neurons in isolation, or the nervous system in isolation from the rest of the organism. What we find in neuroscience is that even C. elegans simulations, where we have like 309 neurons and we know all their connections, if you run them in a computer simulation, they don't actually work. They're just twitching. They don't produce any meaningful behavior. And I think this could be related to the fact that if you were to model, say, a 1920s society using its telegraph network, as an alien species that discovers human society on the planet, you would find that there's a lot of correlation between the behavior of this civilization, its economy, and what's going on in the telegraph network. But you can still not understand it in isolation of the people who operate the telegraphs and everything around them. And there's a lot of evidence that, for instance, glia cells and so on play a role in the way in which our brain operates. Maybe they are important in allocating, distributing rewards to the cells and so on, just at very different time scales than the firing of the neurons. So just looking at neurons might be a too narrow lens to understand minds. But there's something else to be seen. If consciousness can organize information processing in brains, we could hypothesize that it's possible that plants also have software running on them, right? There's spirits on the plants. Plants seem to have means for universal functional approximation. There is a lot of evidence for intra-plant communication, that they communicate in forests over longer distances. There's evidence for communication across different species of plants. Because the issue is that they cannot really build firewalls against each other. They just sit next to each other. The individual cell is passing messages on to the next cell, so they don't know what the origin and semantics of this message is. And so in order to survive, they will need to evolve some kind of a shared protocol where basically they are able to build a forest internet in which they can signal so they get all along. Now, if these spirits of plants are self-organizing software that can entrain itself to run on the cells, and the cells are speaking the same protocol across plants, they might be even able to send feedback loops over longer distances in the forest and migrate around a little bit. It's very interesting that it's so similar to what our ancestors said about what's happening in the forest, that you have these fairies that can move around, and the spirits of plants. And 1 year in fairyland, or 1 day in fairyland, is 7 years in human land. It's a very different time scale where they operate. They're much, much slower than us. So this leads us to the possibility, and again, I don't know whether that's true. I'm just showing you a possibility here. This is not science, this is philosophy. That there could be actually an ecosystemic internet that is not in any way violating physics. It's still all box standard physics. It's just using ordinary cells to send messages to each other, and they self-organize over many millions, even billions of years to produce complicated information processing structure that we mostly don't observe because we are not looking at the right time scale. So what's interesting to me, if we accept the premise of animism, that the difference between living and dead stuff is the software running on the living stuff that is organizing the living stuff, and the software crashes, cell dies or the organism dies, and the region of physical universe becomes up for grabs for other spirits. It's a very interesting perspective. It's the same one that we find in most other cultures, even in our own culture before Christianity and before science kicked out Christianity. Right, so that's a very interesting perspective I found. And when I stumbled on this over the years, it blew my mind, finding myself being turned into an animist. It also gives us a new perspective on evolution. Right? For Darwin, evolution is the competition between organisms and species. And then Dawkins turns it a little bit on its head by saying it's actually the competition between complicated molecules that encode information on how to build organisms. But this takes it one step further. It basically says that evolution is a competition between different software agents. And these software agents are creating organisms to bounce them against each other, and they use the genes to encode the information. But it's actually about the software. It's about the spirits. So for me, there's this very interesting question now. I think we are at the brink of building machines that can think. The present LLMs are not doing this. They're not awake, I think. But I think we will have systems that develop agency, that want stuff. And they will be able to think better than us because they're faster than us. They have more resources. They have a deterministic substrate. And this means there is this danger that we are building silicon golems that are more powerful than us and that can invade the world of the living and that we cannot keep them at bay. And I think we should go the other way around. We should find out how to populate these new substrates with us, with life and consciousness. And this basically leads me to this perspective of cyber animism. Is it possible for us to understand the principles of self-organizing computation across different substrates? And can we build machines that allow us to, for instance, be empathetic with them and they with us, so we can build feedback loops to each other? And we recreate these principles just faster and more efficient. And we can, in some sense, build an AGI for Gaia. Of course, we can also ask ourselves, why would we want to stop at consciousness? Isn't consciousness a bit boring? There are limitations to my consciousness. For instance, if I look at the Necker cube, I can write this wireframe thing. Whether this side is in front or that side is in front is something that we cannot really see, right? So our brain makes a decision. And for most of us, we only see one variant at a time, and it flips between those two interpretations. But we are unable to see the superposition. A lot of our thoughts are happening in superposition and possibility, but we cannot remember this because that would require that there are multiple systems which record all these possibilities in parallel. So we only remember having been on one path. But this is just a limitation of the substrate. If you had a substrate that is less mushy, we would be able to see more possibilities simultaneously as the reality that we are in. Or another thing is this four-dimensional object here, this hypercube. You can look at this for long enough until to make it click and you see how the tesseract works. But for more complicated objects in higher dimensions, it doesn't really work because our substrate is not good enough. And we could be able to see and understand more complicated structures in higher dimensions if we had a better substrate. And another thing is that our time is very short, right? These 3 seconds, like nothing. Why would it not be possible to integrate over much longer time spans and have a much, much longer and wider now? And so I think that these technologies can give us possibly a way to extend ourselves by building machines that offer substrates for us to interface with them, to vibe with them until we're extending ourselves into them. And we will notice that we suddenly have much more intellectual capacity. We can become much smarter, much more conscious systems that can integrate with each other and with reality in a much, much deeper way. So I think we are out of time now. And I think I'll stop here and leave some time for Q&A.